All right, so chapter 12, delivery and style. So now you folks are all done with your outlines, and I'm getting you folks feedback on those. You want to start thinking about putting the little stylistic touches on your speech as you're starting to practice it and starting to think about recording yourself or getting ready to do a Zoom next week. So let's go back to the days of Aristotle. So all the way back in On Rhetoric, which was technically the first textbook on public speaking, he defined style, or lexos arete, as being, let the virtue of style be defined as to be clear and neither flat nor above the dignity of the subject, but appropriate. So he kind of talks about how style is searching for this middle ground, if you will. So you don't want to be completely monotone and boring, and you don't want to be completely over the top either. You want to find something that's kind of in the middle. So you don't want to come across as a pompous, like over the top intellectual, but at the same point in time, you don't want to come across as a dumbass. So Aristotle talks a lot about this in his writings. He, as a matter of fact, he calls it the golden mean. That for a lot of things, you don't want to be too much one way or too much the other. So like, for example, being polite, you don't want to be overly polite, but you don't want to be rude. When it comes to your style, you don't want to be flat, or you don't want to be, completely pompous and bombastic, these kinds of things. So when you're thinking about sort of, crafting your speech, you want to have enough formality in the language that people see you as having high ethos or good character. But at the same point in time, you still want to have enough common language in there that that you have identification or immediacy with regards to the audience. So the first major step in style is now you're going to think about the wording of your speech. So for most of you folks in your outline, you've now got some good quotations, topic sentences, transitions, and there's going to be a little bit more to it than just that. You're thinking about, well, where is the analysis? Where's my personal kind of viewpoints? Where's my interpretation going to go? And this is where you want to start thinking about how you're going to incorporate your words. And of course, the number one goal is to be clear, right? So clarity and speaking style should be your primary goal. That's the number one thing that you're looking for. And when you're thinking about that level of clarity, the first thing is be economical in your wording. So a lot of times, when you're writing out essays, we tend to put in long areas of analysis. So, and that's not the case in oral communication or public speaking. You want to come straight across to your audience. You want to use shorter sentences. You don't want to have 5 clauses in your sentences, lots of ands, buts, fors, and nors, and conjunctions. You just want to have one sentence, one sentence, one sentence kind of thing. This makes it easier for the audience to grab in small little bits, and it's easier for them to comprehend. When you're also wording your speech, you want to use very specific terms and numbers. Back in chapter 4, I think we talked about concrete versus abstract language. And so you want to make sure that you're using specific concrete terms that are easy to understand, easy to sort of relate to. Try to also use short and familiar terms, so things that everybody can identify with, so you're not trying to bring in really crazy different types of language, the words that have no definitions whatsoever, or some advanced terms because you're just trying to come across as being an intellectual. You want to use short and familiar terms because you want to keep the audience's attention and you want to keep them engaged with regards to your wording of your speech. The other big problem that a lot of times people, and I've had these problems too, the notion of assessing your idioms. Are you folks familiar with the term idiom, or have you heard the term idiom before?
Yeah.
Okay. So idioms, of course, they're like short little maxims or phrases, little turns of phrases that people use that kind of like teach a little lesson or point a general point. So last weekend, right, of course, all my roommates, so their friends called up, they're like, hey, let's COVID party. And I'm like, oh God, no, right? And like, no, but of course they're like, Friday night, man, let's get drunk and party. I'm like, stop it, right? But I was listening to them, we were kind of hanging out, and there was just some hypocritical stuff going on. So I totally said the phrase, dude, that's the pot calling the kettle black. Have you folks ever heard the term or the phrase, the pot calling the kettle? Okay. Yeah, they're like, what the heck's that, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, how do you not know that idiom, right? So of course I went around looking it up and tried to figure it all out. And I guess the pot calling the kettle black originally comes from Don Quixote, which is an old book that was written in the 1600s by Cervantes. And I guess there's a moment where Don Quixote is talking to Pancho Villa, and he's like, oh yeah, that's the frying pan calling the pot black or something like that. And so I guess it goes all the way back to the 1600s. And I was like, dude, how did you guys not know this phrase? It goes back to like Spanish literature. Finally, finally, of course, you can also vary the levels of abstraction inside of your speech. So I know it sounds a little contradictory to say, oh, okay, use specific terms, but also you can vary the levels of abstraction. But there is kind of, natural progressions. So usually with public speaking, or at least my style, is, you start off with an introduction that's nice and sort of large or abstract, and then you sort of really focus it down into the main points, which are much more concrete. And then when you get to your conclusion, you go abstract again, sort of implicating your speech to the larger frames that are out there. And if you vary these labels or levels of abstraction, you can find yourself in a much better situation with adapting your speech to the audience. You should also strive for vividness. Oftentimes when you're in your speech, especially if you're doing a pathos appeal or you're trying to appeal to the emotions of your words, using different words that really make your ideas vivid, make them come alive, if you will, in your listeners' minds, can be very, very powerful. So there's a couple of pieces of advice that talks about, of course, using active verbs. So using verbs, instead of saying, in this speech, I am going to grab the attention of the audience, you just put out what your attention grabber is. You say, hey, how many folks are, really didn't get a good night's sleep last night or something like that. Using these active verbs, of course, engage the audience more than trying to use third person passive voice kind of terms. The next slide, I'll talk about these figures of speech, which are tools we can use. And then finally, of course, there's imagery. So one of the big so a lot of times when we're writing up our speeches, we don't think about the different types of imagery we can use. So just as kind of a reminder, remember that when you're describing something, it's not just what it looks like, it can be what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like. All these different types of imagery can add a lot more power to your speech, especially when you're describing an object inside of your informative. Now, in addition to this, I love this stuff. This is my favorite part of English when it's this stuff back in grad school. Figures of speech, or what we call rhetorical tropes of language. There are tons and tons and tons of these. But the textbook, so I pulled this right out of the textbook in chapter 12. It gives you a few. So, I think I talked a little bit about alliteration before. I wrote a paper that had like process, product, person, and I was using P's and I thought it was all clever. But you folks can do that too. So now, when you're thinking up your main points, if you could use like alliteration throughout your points, it'll make it easier for your audience to capture those actual terms. So, like repetition of the initial consonant, so for example, you could say, choose from our 50 famous flavors, right? Or the basement was dirty, dingy, dark, and dank, right? So alliteration, one of those examples you can use to use a consonant sound over and over again. Curious little factoid, if you use a vowel sound over and over again, it's actually called assonance. But in case you wanted to learn something new today. In addition to this, there's also hyperbole. So I'm a big hyperbole guy. I go over the top all the time. But using extreme exaggeration oftentimes can give you some good comedy effects inside of a speech. I was so hungry I could eat a horse, or she's got tons of money. Extreme exaggeration, of course, can add a lot more pathos to your particular speech, or really, sort of give you a larger swath of emotional statements that you can use. I'm sure probably folks have heard of similes and metaphors before, right? You probably got that back in high school. Yeah. So of course, there are comparisons, right? So similes, of course, a comparison of two unlike objects using words like as. So his handshake was as cold as a snowball, or they attacked each other like warriors, right? Or if you don't use like or as, then the metaphor just becomes a comparison of two unlike things. For example, she was feeling blue and totally torn apart, or his heart was broken. Like all these people that are getting Zoom breakups right now, right? In addition to this, you folks can also personify objects. So a lot of times in speeches, people give human characteristics to an inanimate object. This is really popular in like vegetarianism speeches or PETA speeches or speeches with environmental implications. Like, the earth is burning, she's crying out for love, these kinds of things. The examples they got here, the snow blanketed the city, or my car is crying out for some expert attention. And then finally, rhetorical questions do have power. Now, if you do start with a question, try not to make it rhetorical, right? Because you want to get the audience's response back at you. You want them to give you something back. But throughout the course of your speech, you can use rhetorical questions to sort of to get the audience to think a little bit or get them to sort of engage the topic more. So, do you want to be popular? Or would you like to get a raise? These kinds of things inside of your speech can, of course, re-engage the audience, because then it gets them to sort of thinking in what we call interrogatory framework, or they're thinking about the questions themselves. Do we have any questions?
No.
No, so far.
So again, going back to this golden mean that we've talked about earlier with Aristotle, there's a level of what we call appropriateness to your language, right? So in a public speaking situation, you need to be a little bit more formal, right? So you're describing things in a bit more formal language than you would in sort of a conventional conversation. But that appropriate language doesn't need to be over the top, right? So finding that appropriate level of formality is kind of hard to find, but, sort of putting yourself in the mentality that you're giving a speech to a larger audience, sort of puts you into a better framework with regards to levels of formality. And then, of course, you want to avoid written style expressions. So expressions that you would only get if they were written out for you. You want to make sure that you don't engage in those when you're orally communicating to an audience. And then, of course, trying to avoid slang, vulgar, offensive expressions. Right? So my mom always used to say, well, if you got a curse, it just means you're not smart enough to come up with a right adjective instead. And it's kind of true, right? So if you're going around saying a bunch of curse words, odds are you're not employing the formality of language that you need to. It's really tough. I got to say, one of the hardest things about the Zoom world is that when I'm posting videos on YouTube, like if I curse at all, like YouTube flags it and drops it back down. So I'm like, oh, I have to be so formal during these lectures right now, even though it's the most informal kind of framework with regards to lecturing to students.
Maybe drop the Cypress.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, you folks will notice. So so even on lecture 11, there's the Zoom lecture, which has more in it because I have my personal information at the end, but I had to cut it short for YouTube because I didn't want, the entire world being able to find out my phone number. Even though it seems like every robocaller in the world's got me. Jeez. So this all kind of in your own personal style, right? So everybody's got their own personal style. Some of us more sincere, some of us more comedic, everybody's got it. You got to kind of find it. And that's one of the things that I really like about this class is that you really get to self-discover what your style is when talking with other individuals. And so remember, of course, audiences favor speakers who use a personal rather than impersonal style. Right? So people, you feel like you can kind of connect with, like, oh yeah, like the professor, he seems like someone that I can get along with in some kind of way. And little tips that you can do to help this out, using personal pronouns, right? So what's nice is usually in class by this stage, everybody knows each other so well that sometimes they'll even call them out during the speech themselves, which always makes for some nice little cool interpersonal situations. But I guess we probably won't have too much of that inside of this class. Asking correct questions to the audience, which we won't really get much of a chance to do here either. But there are ways in which you can try and create an immediacy when using oral communication as opposed to sort of the stale, distant, third-person written communication that you folks usually get in an English class. Now, we got to speak a little bit about power, right? So these are some interesting studies. Gosh, man, I wish I had an entire class on just this. So there's a lot of research in what we call gender comm. So, talking about males versus females and how they communicate. And a lot of it has come down to linguistic structures that create perceived power. And so just to kind of give you one of the first forerunners who actually thought this stuff, Deborah Tannen, man, she is brilliant. So she is a psycholinguist from Berkeley, and she wrote this book back in, I want to say like the 60s or the 70s. So it was a long, long time ago. You Just Don't Understand. And so she was trying to figure out, of course, we've all heard of the glass ceiling and wage gaps, right? So like, I think the last time I heard it was 81 cents on the dollar that women are making versus men. I don't know. I mean, I don't see why it's jumping so much, but because I sure as I can see more CEOs as female. But so she's trying to figure out, is there something about the workplace that advances men over women? And so she starts looking at language structures because she's a psycholinguist. And so she looks at different types of language structures that convey power. Now it's curious because in an interpersonal context, or if you're just talking with one of your buddies, these quote unquote weak communication styles actually would probably increase the level of interpersonal immediacy. But in formal organizational communication situations, oftentimes these create a powerless form of speech. So when you're thinking about using a public speaking framework, you want to take a look at, and you probably will see them as you folks record yourselves, different powerless speech factors. So the first, of course, is hesitations. I just did one. Uh, so I used to start off with doing ums and uhs and does, and then I started doing like it's like this, like it's like that, right? And then I became the actually guy. I used to always say actually, basically, actually. There's always these ly terms. So, but they're all collectively sort of hesitations. They're all filled verbal pauses that are going to slow down your ability to get to a more powerful message. So try, they're really hard, and I still do them, try to stop hesitations as much as you possibly can. On the other hand, there's also what we call intensifying language. So Trump does this a lot, right? Like, it's the most perfect test ever. It's bigly, it's greatly, it's enormous. You know, he uses so many of these huge intensifiers. And according to Tan's research, it tends to really decrease your credibility as well. So if you're the person who's like, oh, it's so very, 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 very good, you know, these kinds of things. Overusing intensifiers oftentimes can lead us towards more powerless language structures. There's also disqualifiers. So there's a lot of situations in which people will say, well, I might not be an expert in this, but I read an article that says blah, blah, blah. Or you might be in a situation where you disqualify yourself with a tag question. So I really feel like going out to the movies. What do you think? You know, these kinds of things. These disqualifiers tend to pull away from your public speaking your skill, your power when you're communicating towards others. The next area that's pretty close to a disqualifier is a self-critical statement. So almost every semester, I always have a student who, you know, gets up there and they're ready to do their first speech and they go, oh, you know, I'm really bad at public speaking, right? And then you feel bad. You're like, oh, it's okay. You can make it. But self-critical statements already set you off in a bad situation. They already decrease your level of credibility. You know, you're starting off on the wrong foot, and the audience is like, well, you know, I don't really need to pay attention to that. They don't even have confidence in themselves. So finally, of course, slang and vulgar language can pull away from your power structures as well. Again, it gives you that intonation toward other individuals that you haven't taken the time to really word or think about the proper words, adjectives, phrases to describe your particular speech. Are we all still doing okay, or any questions so far?
We're good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So when it comes to the actual sentences themselves, there's a lot to be done with what we call sentence construction. So this is paying careful attention to the construction of the actual sentences in and of themselves. You want to try and use, and of course, you know, you want to shoot for what's appropriate. You know, there's no completely hard and fast descriptor that you can use. So you want to try and use shorter sentences so they're easier for the mind to grasp. You want to use direct sentences, so you're talking straight to the audience as opposed to talking about what you're going to say to the audience. You want to use active versus passive sentences. So you want to make sure that you're using an active first-person voice as opposed to passive. Well, this is what happened on this day. Oh, this is it. This is what's going on right now. It's easier for people to understand positively valenced expressions as opposed to negatively valenced expressions. So instead of talking about what something is not, just describe what something is. And then, of course, you know, I just said short rather than long sentences, but at the end, you know, vary the type and length of the sentences. So I find that, you know, in communication, there's this thing we call a caesura. So it's where you kind of change a linguistic style to kind of create an ebb and a flow. So for me, usually inside of the body points of my speech, I'll have kind of short topic sentences, you know, things that are only like 1 or 2 words, right? So this is about the process, this is about the product, that kind of stuff. And then inside of the body of each one of my main points inside of the speech, I'll have longer, sort of more intellectually engaging quotes. So people get the short little gist of what I'm talking about. And then if they want extra ethos or credibility about that particular topic area, then we can go on and see, you know, the full descriptors of the statistics that come from blank and blank in this particular scenario. Okay, so that takes us through step 7. So that's what you folks are probably going to be kind of working on this week, kind of figuring out and tinkering with the wording of your speech to give it more power or more effect. Step 8, you've pretty much already done. So this will be really quick here. Just remember, you know, when it comes to your persuasive speech, you might want to try and employ this a little bit more. And this is a problem a lot of people have, is that when we write the outline, we kind of just start with the intro and kind of go all the way down. And I usually tell students, no, that's not the best way. What you want to do is you want to start with your main points in the middle and then work your way out. So you know, you do your research, just like we did the research assignment. Then you see where the quotations kind of fall. I know, Danielle, we totally talked about this before.
Yeah.
Sorry, little review for you, right? So you find those main points based on evidence, then you kind of chunk them into the 3 little areas. Then, oh, well, now I got my 3 points. Well, after I wrote my 3 points, then I can write my preview statement, then I can write my review statement, and then I can think about capping it off with kind of a really interesting attention grabber and a really interesting final statement. So remember in general that your conclusion and your introduction really come down to 2 big things, right? So the conclusion, you're just summarizing. You know, you've told them your main points. Now you're going to tell them what you told them. So today we talked about 1, 2, and 3. And then you want to have that big sort of close ending. So you want to find out what that powerful way to finish off the end of your speech really is. And much like that, the same goes for the introduction, right? So the introduction really is about gaining the attention. So the first 3 major steps all have to deal with attention. So you grab the attention of the audience, then you analyze the audience and you say, okay, well, now that I've got your attention, this is why you want to keep your attention on me. And then your credibility statement is, well, that's why I'm someone you should listen to because I've done my homework. I'm going to give you a little bit more information than you'd find via, you know, a Google search for listening to your buddy. So you gain the attention of the audience and then you orient the audience, which is your preview statement. Today we're going to talk about 1, 2, and 3. So that's pretty much what your introduction and what your conclusion is pretty much doing. So a couple little tips, tricks and techniques. A lot of times we get in some common mistakes, right? So when we're doing the speech, you know, you oftentimes, you know, it gets really freaky. You see a lot of faces. That'll be a lot easier in this framework, but trying to engage your listeners before speaking. So establishing eye contact, looking at them, figuring out what they're going to say, or, well, figuring out where they're kind of coming from, and then starting and grabbing their attention, of course, is a good way to start off your intro. You always want to try and be as dynamic and as enthusiastic as possible. Because remember, we talked about, I think all the way back in chapter 1, the emotional contagion hypothesis, which is that if you're up there and you're energetic and you really like what you're talking about, then odds are the students are going to feel that way too. They're going to be more involved in what you have to say. They're going to be more, you know, it's going to spill over. It's going to be contagious, if you will, but in a good way. Not like that stupid virus. Don't apologize, right? You know, it's never let them see you sweat, right? It's so funny because so little of speaking anxiety is actually visual, but it feels so big on the inside, right? So never try to apologize to your audience saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't practice this enough, or I'm sorry, I'm not a bad speaker. All these things eventually just crush your ethos or your credibility when speaking in front of the audience. Reinforce what you've always said. So remember, you know, internal summaries, constant reviews, these all just help the audience understand or remember what you've already told them. And then after your last statements, you know, they're just try not to be that person who just goes, well, thank you, right? And kind of shows off on the side. But on that last statement, the reason why you want to end with that bang is so you can give us that powerful ending and just really hold it until they really get it, kind of thing. So after the last statement, you know, pause, remain, you know, sort of focused on the audience so they know that you've concluded and they can kind of fully process the entire speech that you've given. Now, in addition to your introduction and your conclusion, you can start putting those transitions in between. Most of you folks have done this pretty well. When I was looking over the outlines, everybody's, you know, pretty good at it. You know, here now I'm going to transition from this to this. So transitions, they're also called connectives because you're connecting 2 different thoughts together. And you folks have already kind of done these. So connecting your main points inside of your speech. You know, so there's some debate. So I personally think that really you only need to have transitions in between point 1, point 2, point 2, point 3. You know, like really a speech pretty much really only needs 2 transitions in it, or, you know, whatever the amount of points you have minus 1. Oh. However, the textbook talks about how, you know, you can sort of use a transition to go into your first point or use a transition to come into your conclusion. So if you want to do that, you totally can. It's up to you. But remember now, as your topics get more and more complicated, you're going to start moving towards elevated transitions or internal previews, internal summaries. I think I talked about this briefly last week. I was talking about baking a cake, and then after you've got, so, you know, you got your materials, and then you got the process, you know, how to actually prepare the materials or prepare the cake, and then you got baking the cake. The middle point is going to be a little bit more than the other 2 points. So you might want to use an internal summary. So now that we've talked about how you got to mix the wet ingredients together and how you got to mix the dry ingredients together and then mix them both together until you have a nice smooth dough or batter or whatever, then you can put it in the pan and bake it. Moving on to my third point, how to bake a cake, right? Or whatever, you toss it in the oven and cook it up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much all really about introductions, transitions, and conclusions. Most of you folks have already got that down. Not a big area to talk about. So finally, moving into step 9. Do we have any questions so far? Everybody still doing okay?
Yeah.
We're doing okay.
Okay, cool. All right. So now you're rehearsing your speech. So now you've worked on the wording. You've got all the stylistic tools inside of it. Now you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I deliver a speech? What kind of stance should I take? Should I do all those crazy little mouth things that we did in class beforehand? Red leather, yellow leather, kind of stuff. Work on my articulation. And yeah, you should. As an overview to rehearsing your speech, pretty much there are 3 different ways in which we actually deliver. So usually most students will fall into one of 2 camps. So you've got those students that are completely afraid of public speaking, like, oh no, I took this over the summer because I just wanted to get it over with, right? Or you have people that are like, whatever, dude, I got this, dude. I talk out of my ass all damn day. I don't need to write an outline. I'll just get up there and shoot it, right? And get them. So impromptu, of course, is the latter. So, you know, people that are just, hey, I'm okay with speaking. I can talk about anything. No big deal. So impromptu delivery, speaking without any preparation. So if you've ever seen an improv sketch or any of these things, there are people that have spent years honing their ability to just completely come up with something off the fly. And some people are naturally really, really good at this.
Yeah, I envy those people.
I know, right? Well, maybe you're more on the other side. So some people, they just put themselves, they get so stressed out, they get so wrapped up in their head, they think, I can prepare myself out of this speech, right? So then they end up writing up the entire speech, coming up with every single word perfectly, and they write a complete manuscript for their speech. This isn't good either, right? This puts us in a situation where you end up just reading it all. What's up? Are you all good? Yeah, totally, right? So you end up writing out the entire speech, you end up thinking way too much about it, and you don't end up practicing it. And then when you get into the situation, you're like, oh, okay, well, if I just stick to the text, I'll be okay, right? So then you just end up reading every single word. You don't give us any eye contact. You don't give us any hand gestures. You end up missing time signals, go over time, and it ends up hurting you in the end too. So what you really want to shoot for is what we call an extemporaneous presentation. So something in the middle. This involves thorough preparation. So you've done all your research, you found your good quotations, and you know your main ideas, but you haven't committed yourself to exact wording. You keep practicing it until you kind of say stuff that sounds kind of right, and then when you practice it, it's kind of in your head, but you can change it around as you see fit. So extemporaneous presentations are what we're trying to suggest for. So like for me, when I'm trying to do a speech, you know, I try to get down to at least at the most 5 cards. So one for my intro, and then for each body point, I have 1 card with just the quotes that I'm going to use. So the quotation, quotations, quotations, and then a conclusion card. And so that way, I know what my main points are going to be, and I know exactly the right wording in my quotations. But everything else, you know, my transitions, my topic sentences, these kinds of things are kind of up for fair game. That it's kind of the cards are only the things that I need to have verbatim when I'm actually presenting the speech. Now, when you're rehearsing, you know, there's a lot of pitfalls that happen for people. And I am a victim of these as well, right? So like, I've had so many of these little Zoom videos, right? They're like the first 10 minutes of lecture, like where it's just like, oh, crap. You know, and that's not what you want to do. You want to make sure that you rehearse your speech all the way from beginning to end. So it becomes a big cognitive structure inside of your brain. Even if you do kind of flub, you just stop for a second, deep breath, and just keep on going. You don't start all over again. Because a lot of times we end up saying, oh, don't worry, I'll just start over again. I'll start over again. And then you end up practicing your introduction like 70 times, and then you don't know what the rest of your speech is about. And then when you're actually presenting it, as soon as you get past that part that you've been rehearsing up to, you're like, oh, crap. Like, oh, right? So make sure you rehearse it all the way from beginning to end. Time yourself during each rehearsal. So you want to get that sort of where's your average time for all of your rehearsals and where you're going to come in. I mean, not so important if you're taping yourself because you can just chop it off in the end. But when you're actually in the future doing speeches, you want to time yourself. Try to rehearse the speech under conditions that are as close as possible to those in which you're going to deliver it. So, this is going to be, so actually my biggest fear is not people being able to do their speeches next week, getting people to actually clean up enough of like their room or the part of their house where they can do this speech, right? The first week, as soon as we moved into these Zoom lectures, I was just like, they're taking the exam. I got to clean the shit out of my plate. I just needed to get everything in order. I needed to get it all figured out so I could try to get the conditions so that it actually looks like a reasonable area to speak from. If you do have that full length mirror, try to rehearse it in front of there, so that'll really help you with your nonverbal communication. Usually your bathroom's a good place to actually practice, so your family doesn't get completely ticked off at you, and you still have a big enough mirror that you can see what your nonverbal communication is like. And then, of course, try not to interrupt yourself during your rehearsal to make notes or make changes, because that'll end up skewing your time, and it, of course, gives you that mental break, which is eventually going to happen from these. Okay. All right, so that's the end of step 9. Are we all good? Everybody still doing okay?
Still alive.
Yay!
Yeah, we're doing
okay. Don't worry, we'll get out of here soon enough. Okay, so now voice. So how great does your voice carry? So something we need to talk about a little bit is this notion of paralanguage. So this is situations that are vocal but still nonverbal. So you're not using words, but they're the extra vocal aspects of your delivery style. So things like how loud you are, the volume of your actual speech, which isn't going to be a big factor for this one either. But, in a classroom, sometimes you have to learn that projection voice. The rate or how fast you speak, of course, has a pretty significant impact, and so you can vary that as per your delivery. Your articulation and your pronunciation. So I think we did those word activities in class before we had break. But, making sure that you do a couple of tongue twisters before you present. Peter Piper picked up peck of pickled peppers, or unique New York toy boat. These kinds of things. Over again. Yeah, can at least get your or your articulation and pronunciation up and ready to go before you deliver the speech. And then, much like we talked about earlier, this notion of filled pauses versus unfilled pauses. And of course, the hardest thing about public speaking, trying not to be the person who says, like, actually, basically, these are all filled pauses. You want to just stop and take an unfilled pause to get your point across. Much, much more powerful. So again, now we have issues of body action. This is what I can't stand. Like, I'm a nonverbal guy, and I'm a hand talker, and I want to be like big and out there, and I'm just like a little tiny window in the corner of a PowerPoint. Oh, it drives me nuts. And that's why I'm really trying to tell you folks not to do this PowerPoint Zoom thing, because that, it's so hard to grade somebody just based off of this little tiny window up in the top corner of your screen. So, your body action says a lot, your eye contact, your facial expression, your gestures and your posture, your movements. This has all been my argument about everything. I'm like, if summer stays online, this is what they lose. Like, they are never going to be able to get the skill set to be able to speak with their body as well as with their mouth. That the bodily action has so much that it adds to the delivery style of your speech. And this is why, practicing in front of a bathroom mirror or practicing in front of a full-length mirror really gives you those good insights. And when you record yourself, please try and capture as much of your body as possible too. Like, try not to just do a headshot. You try to get something that's at least from the waist up, or something that can show your body movement or hand gestures, because it's a really key area to coordinate as you're trying to practice your speech. When it comes to using notes, so you've got your outlines in, which is great. Awesome. And I'll have those, I'm going to grade these as soon as I'm done with lecture tonight. Now, where do you go with it from there? Well, so odds are, when you're practicing your speech, the best thing, of course, is note cards, right? If you can do those 5 note cards, you got one for your intro, one for each body point, you got your quotations on it, that gives you the opportunity to move around, especially if you've got different kinds of visual aids behind you, these kinds of things. That's the ideal situation. Now, obviously, we don't have much time, and you're going to be in these weird areas trying to figure out what your speaking scenario looks like. So I would recommend, at least though, that when you go back to your outline, that you make the font bigger. You got to make the font really nice and large so that when you're delivering it into the camera, it's a lot easier for you to follow. So one of the biggest problems, is a lot of times, people print out these, single line outlines to turn in, as a lot of you folks probably did too. But when you have a speaking outline, you want to make sure that I even tell students triple space it, move it to font size 14, because then that's easier for you to follow when you're actually, giving the speech out there. So no matter how you're doing it, I don't know if you're gonna be doing it off your computer or if you still have a printer at home or anything like that, but you want to put yourself in a situation where it's easy for you to read what you've got laid out so you can come back to it and don't lose your place that often. So remember, of course, you have your delivery outline. You want to use smooth notes during your speech. Try to only use your outline and have it large and big and easy to read, and go over it plenty of times so you folks are really good with it. And if you do have the time and you happen to have index cards laying around your house, or you can, I just bought some for like $1 at Dollar Tree, it does give you a lot more freedom when it comes to practicing your actual speech. Okay, finally, so these aren't that big, so I'm just going to go over them real quick. So right now, focus on practicing your speech, focus on getting that information in there, focus on making sure that you're in the time constraints and try and figure out all this video equipment. So next week, we'll do some speeches that everybody, who can't figure out the video cameras or whatever, we'll do those via Zoom. And then afterwards, I just put these in here because when you folks are critically evaluating somebody else in the class, so everybody's going to need to watch one other person in the class, these are some questions, right? So like, is the subject worthwhile? Is the general purpose informative or persuasive? Is it narrow enough? Is it clear to the audience? Does the thesis only have one main idea? Does it have audience analysis? Does it actually, view the audience as being someone who's knowledgeable? Is it adequately researched? Does it seem like the person understands the topic area? All these things are questions you want to ask yourself while watching another person out there, right? So are they clearly related to the thesis? What's the organizational pattern? Does it help the audience follow the speech? Are there good transitions? Is the language clear? All these things. So as you folks are working or sort of finishing off your outline right now, you can use these questions as kind of a guideline to see what a good speech should probably have. And then next week, after we start posting these bad boys up online, or as they start going up online this week even, you can now go back and analyze somebody else. And then these questions should give you folks a couple of good ideas to do with regards to critically evaluating speeches. Finally, of course, remember, we always want to do like a criticism sandwich, right? Like something nice first, then a little bit of negativity in the middle, and then try to focus and then try to finish off with something nice. And then, of course, people are going to be, writing critiques about your speech. So try to take it with an open mind, accept the viewpoints, all that good stuff. So these last 4 slides, not so important for this week, but as we start to critique stuff next week, you can take a look over them, and I might be able to help you folks with that one pager or some base of the class. Okay, all right.